Hello, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, the world is a finite place. And yet, humanity's capacity to generate garbage seems infinite. Oh my God, how are those two going to work? How do you square that circle? Stacey.
Max, well, the circle is not being squared, and in fact, there's a finite amount of space even in the financial system where many think you can print an infinite number of dollars. Well, China is saying Yankee go home to all American toxic waste, whether it is actual trash, garbage trash sort of stuff, or trashy U.S. Treasury bonds. So they don't want any of them. Here's the first headline: Recycling chaos in U.S. as China bans foreign waste. And they set out to look at the classical virtue signaling sort of, Portland, Oregon couple and what it means to virtue signaling. Essentially, it's going to get a lot more expensive to signal your virtue. Like many Portland residents, Satish and Arlene Palshikar are serious recyclers. Their house is coated with recycled bluish-white paint. They recycle their rainwater, compost their food waste, and carefully separate the paper and plastic they toss out. But recently, after loading up their Prius and driving to a sorting facility, they got a shock. Quote, "The fellow said, 'We don't take plastic anymore,'" Satish says. "It should go in the trash." So apparently, China has said basta. From January 1st is the official date. No more foreign waste will they accept. All those container ships of plastics and cardboard and all sorts of stuff sent to China to recycle. Well, they don't want any of it anymore.
Yes, well, I remember the story about an entrepreneur in China, this woman who noticed that all of these big cargo ships that were going to China returned to China empty. Because, of course, America doesn't export anything to China. They only import. She said, well, send us your garbage. Send us your corrugated cardboard, for one thing. And she recycled it and refabricated it in China and sold it back to the U.S., essentially, and she became a billionaire. And there was this huge garbage trade flowing from America to China. America's biggest export to China was garbage, literally garbage, huge tankers full of waste. And now China has hit the maximum capacity for garbage and toxic sludge and air pollution, and people are choking to death on the street, and mercury poisoning is killing babies and whatnot. So the government's like, hey, maybe we should take less garbage from America. So they put the kibosh on this whole garbage export business. And now, as you point out, these virtue signalers, in other words, Weasley types in Portlandia, which is a great show, by the way, are unable to exercise their virtue by composting their own banana peels and by growing, their own organic plants in the backyard and dividing plastic and whatnot in the recycling bin. They have to now pay. That's the bottom line. They got to pay.
Well, actually, part of the problem has been that they do not recycle. They do not separate plastics. So if, in fact, in our own community, you'll see that the recycling section is just you dump it all, plastic, paper, anything. So people have been putting their stuffed animals, wool sweaters, all sorts of stuff in this thing. And compressing it into a bale and then sending that bale via container to China. And then China has to separate them all out. The fact that it's all blended together, that's causing the toxic sort of environmental disaster there in China. And so they'll go into the details. You mentioned that the U.S. exports all this garbage to China. And we're not just talking about the U.S. Treasury bonds, because they send a lot of that garbage, and they send Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac sort of housing mortgage-backed securities and stuff like that. But on the other end, they send those at the higher end, and on the lower end, they send all of this stuff. And the data is that the U.S. exports about 1/3 of its recycling, and nearly half goes to China. For decades, China has used recyclables from around the world to supply its manufacturing boom. But this summer, it declared that this foreign waste includes too many other non-recyclable materials that are dirty, even hazardous. In a filing with the World Trade Organization, the country lists 24 kinds of solid waste it would ban to protect China's environmental interests and people's health. The complete ban takes place from January 1st, but already some Chinese importers have not had their licenses renewed. This is leaving U.S. recycling companies scrambling to adapt. So they look at a company called Rogue Waste Systems in Southern Oregon, which is, you know, they've received all of this recycled stuff. They package it and compress it into a bale in which they put into a container and ship to China. But as China is no longer willing to accept it, it's piling up while they look for somebody else around the world willing to accept it. To actually do this job in the U.S. is too expensive to separate it all out and recycle appropriately. So they're looking for somebody to send it to. In the meantime, local authorities are just telling them to send it to the local dump. So these people, a lot of people are feeling like they're doing well, and I drive a Prius and I recycle. But in fact, they're recycling, all that work they're doing to recycle is actually just going into the local landfill.
Yeah, it'll all back up, and it'll just create a toxic environment. You know, ultimately, corporations who package this stuff in plastics, of course, this would fall into the category of externality. You know, they don't pay for the environmental cost. And they will never be forced to pay for the environmental cost. It's one of the subsidies that we as human beings give to corporations. We're willing to compromise our health by having to live in a garbage dump so that these corporations can continue to make unaccounted for profits, essentially, and avoid these problems, but to their gated cities and fortresses. So they have a fortress mentality.
This is the whole kind of process we've been covering over the past few years on Keiser Report, is the deglobalization. We've lived through very relatively easy times. I think in 50 years' time, people will look back and say, wow, that period of time between after the OPEC oil embargo, from that period up until about now was just like everything, all the prices were going down, goods were going down, shipping everything around the world, just-in-time delivery, everything was all perfect and cheap. And now I think we've hit the bottom there, and it looks like costs are starting to rise because, as this Rogue Waste System says, right now, all this recycling is technically garbage, but there are now international regulations about how much you have to recycle. So recycling will have to happen, and it's going to cost more. So therefore, your products are going to cost more. One of the articles about this China story says that, Amazon, for example, is going to get hit really hard because they buy almost a lot of their packaging is provided by the recycled end product that has been until now created in China. The guy who runs Rogue Waste Systems that I talked about, Scott Fowler, he talks about what Americans have been putting in their recycling bins that are technically not recyclable and has always just been put into these one-ton bales that get sent to China. He points out a roll of linoleum, gas cans, a briefcase, a surprising number of knitted sweaters. Plus, there are frozen food cartons and plastic bags that many people think are recyclable, but are not.
Well, these carbon nanotubes are incredibly strong, and apparently you can create a geosynchronous satellite above planet Earth on a rope made of carbon nanotubes. So you can get into outer space quite quickly, like you just take an elevator 5 minutes up. From there, that staging platform, you can load up containers and rockets and ferry the garbage to the moon, which is our most closest satellite. And the dark side of the moon is also geosynchronous to planet Earth. You don't see the dark side of the moon. Mm-hmm. And turn that into an incredible garbage dump. And just get Elon Musk or one of these other guys to work this all out, Sir Richard Branson, and you create a garbage ferry on this new technology and just create the dark side of the moon dump. I mean, that's obviously the answer to this.
Well, a lot of people, all sorts of, not just Elon Musk, a lot of people are working on private satellites. Maybe they might invent a chute that just shoots garbage into outer space.
A garbage cannon.
A garbage cannon and one.
That's a railgun. Railgun, you can shoot a projectile into outer space on 2 nuclear-powered rails, essentially. And yeah, you could just shoot garbage satellites into outer space. That would be cool. It's already cluttered with various broken satellite parts. Nobody would know the difference if you've got like old diapers and stuff floating around in outer space, blanketing planet Earth.
Well, of course, Stephen Hawking is right that one day aliens will come visit us, and we should try to avoid them ever coming to visit us. But if all our trash keeps on showing up on their planet, it might encourage them to come look for us. And who the hell is sending us all of these old diapers?
Right. You know, that's our mark of who we are. You know, the radio signals from planet Earth that are still being emitted into outer space are the television signals that were first broadcast in the 1940s. And, of course, those were Adolf Hitler's speeches that were televised. Those waves are the first waves to leave planet Earth and to travel into outer space. So aliens, if they do intercept rays or signals from planet Earth from the 1940s, their first introduction to humanity will be Adolf Hitler, and that'll be their first impression. You know, you can never make a first impression twice. Is that how it goes?
That's something like that, yes. So right now, by definition, they say that material out there is garbage, referring to the stack of all these recyclables. It has no value. There is no demand for it in the marketplace. It's garbage. And in China itself, because they're not accepting any of this stuff, there is also a problem with a lot of old ladies go around collecting all this sort of garbage and separating it, and they have no market. Now, finally, on this last headline here, this is a tweet that came out, I think it was via Bloomberg, and speaking of garbage and China no longer willing to accept it, and what that might mean for virtue signaling, because a lot of our U.S. military is the support via the media is because we're such great virtuous people. We're going to save those women of Afghanistan. We're going to save those people of Benghazi. We're going to save those people in various oil-rich nations around the world. We're going to help them, right? Well, China's appetite for treasuries may be about to ebb, just as America needs its biggest foreign creditor to help finance a growing budget deficit. Of course, the budget deficit is not helped by the expanding military budget, which is totally financed by China. And if they no longer have the appetite for treasuries, this is the thing that we've been looking at for years. Of course, a lot of our guests are always like, whenever they stop buying up treasuries, it's going to go all horribly wrong.
Right. So it's amazing that these two things are incidental, that they're not taking the garbage of the American fiat money either. You could send them truckloads worth of dollars and $100 bills, and they would say, no, we don't take that garbage anymore. And, of course, that means that the ability to neutralize the effect of all that money printing disappears, so that would come back into the economy in the form of inflation. So we're starting to see some early warnings of inflation on the margins. The ability to hide that is disappearing rapidly. Okay, well, we got to
rapidly exit to the second half.
Yeah, we'll take a break. Take a break and come back for the second half. Yeah, why not? Well, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time to return to our conversation with Marshall Orbach. He is a research associate at the Levy Institute, all-around nice guy, ex-hockey player. Marshall, welcome back.
Not a good hockey player.
No, well, you got to the junior high school level in Canada.
Basically, that's right.
Have you ever seen that video on YouTube, Birth of a Canadian? You see ice, there's a hole in the ice, and then a man emerges from the ice
I have seen that.
with a hockey stick and a puck.
Well, that's true. That's how we are.
That's how you were born.
That's how I was born, yeah. That's
incredible.
Right. Yeah.
You can see that on YouTube. All right, let's talk about, let's move on to some other topics of concern. Your thoughts on the crypto economy. Will this take down the economic system as we've known it? What do you thought? We have crypto economy.
Look, if you look at the history of money, anybody can create an IOU or conduct a commercial transaction with another person, provided both parties are willing to accept payment in the same medium of exchange. So in that sense, Bitcoin or whatever other cryptocurrency you want is fine if that's how they want to settle it. But if you really want to ensure a cryptocurrency's long-term viability, then the easiest way to do that is by allowing you to extinguish your tax liabilities by using bitcoins. If the government was ever able to do that, then that would confer a huge, immediate, and additional demand on the currency right now, because you would grab those bitcoins because you would actually be able to extinguish your tax liabilities with the government. Now, my guess is that the U.S. government, or for that matter, any other sovereign government, is not going to be keen to lose its monopoly issue of the currency, and so they won't allow that. But that, if you really wanted to have a viable alternative currency, that would be the best way to do that. If the government decided tomorrow that, for example, you can pay your taxes in beaver pelts, you'd probably get a revival in demand for beaver pelts.
Well, the government is clearly not on board with the idea of having citizens create their own currency.
Yeah.
The government likes to be able to control that. And so the question is really, I don't know if you've...
Well, the government is constitutionally mandated to handle that role. That was a role that was given to them. So it's not if it's a dictatorship or a monopolist role, it was conferred on them by the fathers of independence.
Yes, and this ability now of individuals to create their own sovereignty by creating their own currency. My question is, you're a smart guy over at the Levy Institute. You guys sit around and talk about the big issues all day long. I mean, is this a threat to banks? In other words, banks, they're nervous. They're a bit nervous about this because it threatens their monopoly.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out?
I have to admit, look, I'm in the camp that says it's probably a bubble. I know you with your Bitcoin button and have a different view of this. I must admit that when I hear Jamie Dimon, go on against it, it does make me much more sympathetic to the holders of Bitcoin. I can certainly understand. We've talked before about the massive political dysfunction.
Because you're a rebel. You don't like Jamie Dimon.
No, I don't.
You're a rebel. You're on the side of the crypto sovereign movement.
I can understand the objectives behind it. I certainly feel that they have a legitimate beef against a system which they feel is stitched up against them, and so I think that they've. I can certainly understand why this thing has developed, the political context for which in which it's developed. I'm just trying to say that if you really want it to be on sound footing, that's the way you would have to do it, and you'd have to have some cooperation from the government to do it that way.
Well, I mean,
but in the meantime,
I think the crypto community feels that it'll drain so much capital away from banks, central banks, and government that they'll
have an alternative. Look, I mean. If you can point to one historical example of this, libertarian fantasy that has actually existed somewhere, then that's great. But William Golding, I think, wrote about this in Lord of the Flies. So
that's a very dystopian take on Bitcoin, Marshall Albrecht. I'm moving on. All right, the Republicans are pushing through tax reform. Many who watch MSNBC may not know there are actually any domestic matters unrelated to the Russia's President Putin scandal hoax. Your thoughts on what you see? Okay, tax reform, what's going on there?
Well, it's pretty regressive. Meaning that it confers a lot more benefits to the top 1% than it does to the middle class or the working class. There's a whole lot of goodies in it for corporations as well. There's talk about, we've got one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, 35%. That's bogus. With all the exemptions that are already written into the code, the effective tax rate for most large corporations is more like 15. So I've seen some estimates as low as 12%.
No, like General Electric, I think they filed a 7,000-page tax return, and they got a tax rebate.
Yeah, and that's right. And then you've got companies like Apple that domicile a lot of their facilities in places like Jersey, tax havens like Jersey and the Channel Islands, so mitigate their tax bill. So there are. It's an unnecessary giveaway in a lot of respects. There isn't that much done for personal income tax holders. And look, my big, and that's really the grounds in which I think you should object to this bill, is that it's highly regressive. And also, it will probably do very, very little for employment growth and for creating income growth, which should be the goal behind it. And in that regard, I think that those are the grounds for objecting to it. Of course, the Democrats are being very foolish because they keep on saying, well, it's going to add to the deficit, and that's absolutely awful. But of course, the minute you start taking that argument, you are effectively ceding, you're effectively embracing the paradigm that the Republicans use. Because the next stage of that is going to be that in a few years' time, if the deficits do in fact grow as a result of this tax reform, then the Republicans, like Paul Ryan, are going to say, you see, we've got to get hold of entitlements now because the deficits are way too large. And they're going to attack Social Security and Medicare. And then they'll turn to the Democrats and say, and you see, you guys basically expressed so much concern about the deficit earlier, so let's do something about it. So it's a trap. And the Democrats, like Nancy Pelosi, for example, are falling right into it.
Okay, just a quick digression back to MMT, modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about it. You said, you guys don't look at interest rates as a way to manage the economy, more on the tax side, the fiscal side.
Yeah,
so
it's
now
a more effective tool.
We're talking about taxes now.
Yeah.
So in your view, what would be more of an ideal tax structure?
That's a political judgment.
But what do you think would be the sweet spot for how taxes are levied across the economic spectrum?
You're asking me to make an a priori judgment. I would say that you can't really.
So what's wrong with the current tax regime?
This is my own personal opinion. I think you'll find that MMTers have as many different views as there are varieties of ketchup. So my own feeling is that the current tax code is too complex. It has become a political plaything for lobbyists.
Do you support a flat tax?
I am generally in favor of tax simplification. I'd probably go for some elements of progressivity to help mitigate inequality.
Right, so just like two or three basic levels, and then get rid of all the loopholes.
Yeah, that would be my...
I'm totally in favor of that. Why don't we do that?
Because
all the lobbyists who like all the tax breaks.
That's right, the corporate, because the real welfare queens that we have to worry about are corporations.
Okay, so you're the real welfare queens are corporations.
Yeah, corporate, and they love their corporate welfare.
It's socialism for the rich.
And capitalism for the rest of us. Yeah, that's right.
We take the risks.
Yeah,
they take the gains.
Yeah, that's right. And they get the bailouts when times get tough. So you're right.
Through the primary lever of interest rates at the central bank. But I don't want to go there. Let's move on. What else do I have in my goodies? Oh, the 2018 midterms are coming up. Do you see any economic ideas coming from any of these Democrats?
Bernie Sanders has a few. That's largely because he's got a great economist working for him, Stephanie Kelton, who's a
she's still with the Bernie camp?
She still is affiliated with them, still advises them. So he's probably one, and I'm sure there are others out there. But a better deal that they introduced didn't have much that was new to it. There were some interesting aspects of talking about concentrations of monopolies and
any names that we're not familiar with. Like, remember, Barack Obama came out of nowhere.
No.
Donald Trump was kind of like, where did this guy suddenly?
Unfortunately not. The ones that keep getting named are unfortunately being, a lot of them get ensnared in other kinds of scandals. But no, that's a real problem with the Democrats. They don't have a lot of bench strength. I mean, their leadership is basically...
I've always seen to me that the Democratic Party relies on charisma, whereas the Republicans have policies that they just keep hammering consistently. They don't change much. Whereas the Democrats, you have like a Bill Clinton or a JFK, who are very charismatic, or Barack Obama.
Well, I would say Ronald Reagan was very charismatic, even if you didn't agree with his politics. But no, what I would say the fundamental difference is that the Democrats go out of their way to insult and ignore their base's aspirations, whereas the Republicans, at least in word, pay
at least they
attention
pay lip service.
Yeah, and they also aren't afraid to introduce crazy, quote unquote, crazy ideas, because that what happened, for example, under Bush and Cheney is that they would introduce an idea and people would say, you can't do that, that's an absolutely crazy idea. But you repeat it long enough and eventually you change the political landscape. Whereas the Democrats are always trying to be reasonable, and in the context of being reasonable, they never will introduce new ideas, and they will stick with the existing paradigms, and that's why they keep losing elections.
I think that's very insightful. And a lesson, perhaps, that these guys in the Democratic Party should embrace.
And they do need new leadership. I mean, as I said, look, the three leading Democrats in the House are all in their late 70s. All the people that are being talked about as 2020 presidential candidates, Sanders, Warren, and Biden, they're all in their mid to late 70s. You've got a few young names like Kamala Harris being talked about. But again, Not much is known about her background, and there isn't enough. There's really not enough new bench strength. There's a few interesting people at the state level.
There's a huge influx of women across the spectrum, across America, in the wake of these sex scandals. So women are getting more political. Is that a trend that you're aware of? And do you see that having an impact in 2018 and 2020?
Yeah, it seems to have had an impact in the last set of elections we had, the special elections and the elections we had in Virginia. Look,
are men obsolete?
My view.
Do you cover that at the Levy Institute?
I don't know.
I mean,
Look,
they've got
my
artificial sperm. They've got artificial insemination. They don't need us anymore, Marshall. We're relics from a previous era. They're setting us up for the big extermination. Everyone's a sex predator. They're just going to throw us off a cliff, and it's just going to be a world run by women.
That's his view, not mine. For the record, look, what I will say is,
I embrace my new female overlords.
Yeah, me too. I think we men have spent enough time screwing up the world. Let women have a turn at doing it.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, sure.
It's all intellectual property now. You don't need muscles.
Well, I remember once
being
at a conference and I heard Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, and she said that she thought the economic environment post 2008 might have been a bit different if we had had Lehman sisters rather than Lehman brothers.
All right, Marshall, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me again, I think.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Marshall Orbach from the Levy Institute. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.